Okay. Welcome, one and all, to yet another episode of WIC TV, cross-ideological space where we come together to talk about issues both political and cultural, from the silly to the serious. Today we're taking a bit of a break from politics. We're going to be talking about some of the changes upcoming to Wizards of the Coast's Dungeons and Dragons. There's been a lot of hoopla over some of the leaks that have come out, both regards to rules changes as well as alleged directions that WOTC is thinking of going in when it comes to marketing and when it comes to the game itself. Recently, the NDAs that have been given to content creators and others who have seen the content has expired, and we have been able to get a much better look at some of the changes that have been implemented and are coming out in 5.5e Dungeons and Dragons. I've gathered a team, the nerdiest nerds I could find, okay, to talk about this topic, to discuss WOTC and the direction that they're taking it, and whether or not this is going to be good for the hobby, good for the game, and yeah, just things like that. So I want to thank all of my guests for being here. I want to thank you, my dear audience, for being here. And I want to give each of these individuals a chance to introduce themselves. We should have one more coming. I'm going to DM them and get them in here. But let's start with Multiculturalist James. Tell us who you are and what your thoughts are on not only the changes themselves, but also just the direction WOTC is going. Go ahead, please.
Okay. Well, yeah, I'm James. Multiculturalist James is my brand that you can just go to either on Twitch, YouTube, all this other stuff. I had planned to go into a lot of multicultural things, which D&D and tabletop RPGs do have. But yeah, I've been kind of just focused on TTRPGs because it's been a passion and a love of my life for a while. So just kind of focused on there and been in the sidelines of Twitch Pulse space and a lot of other things as well. So where to go with where WOTC is going with the product? I think in general, it's a good thing. For one thing, the new edition coming out, I think it's good that there are people who are going to be listening to the advances of whatever the game is, especially now that it has such a wide breadth after the emergence of COVID, into which you had many people then going into an online space and then becoming virtual gamers instead of necessarily IRL gamers. That just boomed immediately. And you had that with the advent of a lot of other things that came up. People liked Critical Role, which was one of the series that you could get into to understand how to then play D&D. When you read a book like this, it can be pretty harrowing, especially if you have to get 3 books like this, a Monster Manual, a Player's Handbook, and the Dungeon Master's Guide, all for a total previously of $150, which now I think is going to be, $180? If I'm not mistaken, $60 per book. That's a hefty cost. But the digital space expanded, and with that, we then were able to then see how it then continued throughout the space. We had Drive-Thru RPG and the DMs Guild, and then a lot of other virtual tabletops pop up. The first one to the scene being Roll20, then the Forge. If I remember, what is it? It's Fantasy Grounds, Owlbear Rodeo, and now because D&D or WOTC has been listening to the people that they're catering to, or it's just their general market audience, they have MAPS, capital MAPS, which is just simply a VTT that you can then put any of the acquired tokens or adventures that you have onto the map for WOTC, for that, so that you can play online for very, very little resolution. And so anybody who has an online space can play on it with that in like Discord or whatever Zoom call you want to do. There is a quote unquote woke side to this, and there's also an anti-woke side to this, and I'll get to both of them. I have strengths, steelmans that I can do for both, and I also have critiques of both. So we'll get into it when we get into it.
Now, thanks for being here, and I'm sure we will go over it as we can. Next up, Bairn. I think that's how you say your name. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I'm Buddy. Everybody on the panel, you guys can call me Buddy. So I am one half of the Some Derps Talk About Games podcast, and I am also a lifelong lover of D&D. And generally speaking, I'm very pro the changes, and mostly it comes down to the moniker that we're using, right? 5.5e, right? I was around when the original 3.0 came out and then was updated to 3.5, and I remember what that process process was like. And I thought of it like this was the golden age. I was in high school, you know, we were going over to our friend's house and playing 3.5 and making wacky builds that were completely ridiculous because that whole section of the game, that whole lifestyle of the game was completely bonkers for, you know, as long as it lasted. And I see a lot of indicators that show you that what we're calling 5.5e matches that feeling quite a lot. I am a little bit of a skeptic when it comes to WOTC and Hasbro. I don't love sort of the direction of the company. I think that there are a lot of things that, you know, we might be able to critique about how they have approached D&D, both as sort of a product and as a game. But also at the same time, I think, you know, there's this sort of optimistic swell in the community that they are trying to capitalize on. And my hope is that they can sort of turn around from some of the decisions that I wouldn't agree with as much in order to bring in 5.5e for that glorious landing like we had 20 years ago, okay, when the 3.5 edition came out.
Okay, well, thanks for being here, and I'm sure we'll get into it as we go. Next up, Avalon God. I think I'm saying your name right.
Yeah, well, I mean, you just call me Chris if you happen to remember it. So I'm probably, or maybe one of the weirdest people on the panel today in that I'm actually a psychologist, and I do a lot of research, and I work at Stetson University, which is just like the hat guy, basically. And I'm down here in Florida, and for probably about 2 decades now, I've done a lot of research on media and technology and stuff related to that. Probably, you know, there's really no such thing as a famous psychologist, but I'm probably like most quote unquote famous for work on video game violence, actually. So I did that work for a long, long time, and I've worked on other kind of media issues as well. But you know, a lot of the stuff that interests me about D&D right now, particularly the sort of 5.5 or whatever we're calling this edition, is like multicultural, as James mentioned. A lot of the sort of the culture war debate around the issue, but also trying to bring some data in trying to inform, like, are people's concerns, do they have any data behind them, or is this you know, are people's worries sort of a moral panic, or you know, which comes up with a lot of media and technology. I've been playing since first edition, so I'm pretty old. And you know, so I've been around, you know, in terms of, you know, my thoughts about, you know, 5.5, you know, I'm probably on the more reluctant side, but a lot of that's just because I am old and I've gone through 5 editions and I like 5th edition. And so, you know, buying, like you said, $160, $70, $80 worth of new books feels like, I mean, I kind of like 5th edition. I'm happy kind of staying where I'm at and such. So, but I don't know. But we'll see, you know, what comes of it. So I'll probably be a late adopter if I adopt it at all.
Okay, well, thank you for being here, and we will
thanks
get
for having me.
into it as we go. Last but certainly not least, at least until our 5th person joins us, Gelatinous Rube. Give us what you got.
Howdy, I'm Gelatinous Rube. You can also call me James. I'm a 5th edition third-party tabletop designer, primarily invested in 5th edition. I've been doing that for, I want to say, 8 years now, and I'm generally anti the 5.5 changes. I think that they were mostly a mix of like personal pet peeves and cool stuff that the designers thought of at a given moment and then just kind of threw into the game without a real regard for placement or mechanical effect or whether or not it would produce a more exciting game, a more valuable game. I'm pretty down on 1D&D or 5.5e. I mostly regard it as an attempt to recapture some losing ground that's being lost, like Call of Cthulhu, the World of Darkness games, and most prominently Pathfinder 2nd Edition and its recent remaster. I think it's, if I had to sum it up, I think that this is mostly a cash grab designed to make sure that people can enter the hobby as quickly as possible, spend as much money as possible, or as reasonable, I guess, and by virtue of making D&D their first RPG and making sure that it's their first RPG, not really giving them anything to aspire to or hope for outside of what D&D can offer, and make it more difficult to leave. to other systems like Pathfinder Second Edition, which are going to give them or even prior editions of D&D. So I'm down on the whole thing.
Okay, and with that, let's open up the floor. So, you guys, and I want to start here first. You mentioned some of the specific changes that you think were, and I believe, Rube, you said this directly, that you think were just kind of thrown in there without regard to mechanics and how that will play out in the table. Can you give us a specific example?
Sure. So if I'm going over the Ranger class, for instance, that's one of my favorite classes. It was the first one that I ever played. Notoriously poorly designed. Most of its core features were not really features at all. There's something called ribbon abilities, which are not intended to really interface with the rest of the game or cause events of consequence that are going to impact your character's progression or general status throughout the world. You were getting these features, favored enemy and favored terrain, right around the same time that the closest class to you in terms of progression and track was the paladin, and they're getting things like I add +5 to all, or I add my charisma modifier to all of my saving throws. I have these cool extra damage resources, which get even more powerful when they're targeting a favored enemy of theirs. It was a very frustrating class to play. And rather than solve these issues, they have been sidelined. They have been replaced. There's a bigger focus on favored spells of the Ranger, things that people are used to casting already, like Hunter's Mark. It's still concentration, meaning, sorry for all the mechanical talk, but it's still concentration, meaning it now has to be any other concentration spell needs to be compared against and is exclusive with Hunter's Mark itself. They kept concentration on it for some reason. They know that it's a class feature. People treat it like a class feature. It behaves like a class feature, and they still kept it as a spell that has concentration to keep it exclusive with other things that the Ranger might combine it with. And at the very pinnacle of the class, I think your level 20 ability is something like, oh, there it is. Hunter's Mark now deals 1d10 damage instead of 1d6. And like that I think encapsulates my problem with 1D&D. That sounds like a cool improvement that somebody thought of, and they just didn't know where to place it. And level 20 was the last thing that they had left to place, so they said, all right, well, that's the blank spot, so we just throw it there. We want to make sure we have all of our cool stuff in. It's not for a game that has like a consistent loop. It's not for a game where you think about things like progression. I don't think they...
Okay, so I'll fight you on this point. I don't love the redesign of the Ranger either. I am a deep Ranger enjoyer, and I even have enjoyed Ranger features that you called out as being poor features, right? Favorite enemy, favorite terrain. I think that, as a game designer, like from a top-down game design level, I understand why these are bad, right? They flatten the play experience for the Ranger because it means that the Ranger is hyper efficient at certain kinds of encounters and dog shit at other kinds of encounters, right? When I'm not getting my favorite enemy bonus, that's bad, right? But those have both been stripped out of the class in 5.5e, right? So the things that you identified as problems are present in 5e and gone in 5.5e and replaced with features that were added in Tasha's to make it a more well-rounded class that wasn't necessarily so pigeonholed into this, hyper specific niche. So how do you feel about that? Doesn't that suggest that the Ranger is that there are improvements for the Ranger in 5.5e?
No, I think that they've been re-pigeonholed into just casting a singular spell that is exclusive with all of their other cool, interesting spells, except they get this one for free and it lasts for really long duration. So you feel compelled to get the most out of it that you possibly can, rather than just ditch the concentration spell and cast something else.
Sure. So even if I were to grant that, right, like I would say, yes, I agree that that's bad. We had that version of Hunter's Mark, or whatever it's called, Hunter's Quarry, I guess, is also in 5e, right? So these things are the same. And then 5.5e removes the problematic aspects of the favored terrain and favored enemy features. Wouldn't we call that an improvement? One bad thing remains the same, it's still bad, and then one other bad thing has been removed and is improved?
No, not necessarily. I generally think that if you've just, again, I'm looking for intention behind the design. I'm looking for some evidence that these people are thinking about prior problems with the game, looking to fix them, and bring the game into sort of a holistic state that people can stand playing past level 7. And that's not what I'm seeing here. If you just remove the thing that didn't work for obvious reasons, but could work if you just added a little bit more gameplay into the game, then I would be happy with it. But they didn't. They said, we're not going to go in that direction.
I want to move off from specifically the Ranger just for a moment, right? And get maybe a little more broader discussion going with the changes overall. And just like a show of hands, right? Who here thinks that overall, right, the changes between 5th edition and 5.5 edition, or 1 D&D, whatever you want to call it, who thinks they were largely positive? You just raise your hand. Okay, we got 1, 2.5, let's say 2.5.
Sure.
So James, multiculturalist James, because there's 2 James now. I'll just call you multiculturalist.
That's fine. MC James is fine too. Whatever you want.
We'll call you MC James, okay? MC,
All right.
what is positive for you? So our friend Bairn mentioned that the Ranger changes, while there are still problems, there were some market improvements regarding favored terrain, favored enemy, etc. What are some of your reasons that you think that 5.5e is an upgrade to 5th edition, rules-wise? Go ahead. Oh, and thank you, J-Mac, for the 10 gifted memberships. Continue.
Well, I'll be honest. I have probably little to offer in terms of the rules-wise of there. I've seen what I can of the player's handbook from what other people have then been able to show when they've been able to show it. Jordan, the PH is silent, a YouTuber in the space, unfortunately, came into some trouble with a strike on his channel, and so in any case, he got it resolved. But as far as I can say, rules-wise, from what I've heard, in general, it doesn't seem to be anything drastic. I can talk about things that are not exactly rules-wise in terms of combat, but things that have been addressed. I think alignment is very quickly addressed, but it doesn't give anything specific about it. If I remember, there is this. I thought that this was a positive addition, and I don't know if this is in the player's handbook or if it's going to be in the upcoming Dungeon Master's Guide, but it has been talked about. It's either called Battalion, Garrison, I forget what it's called.
Is what you're thinking of.
That's it. Yep, the Bastion system. I think that's at least a decent attempt to address how to then manage a lot of what you might get if you have a longer campaign and then you're building a home base or something like that. In the Dungeon Master's Guide for 5th edition, it actually does have some of the OG 5th edition. It does have some rules on how much like I think a tavern might cost, or like a general building of some sort, but it doesn't get into specifics about it. So I think as far as critique for like what 5.5 is going to be, or 6e, whatever you want to say, is that it's not going in depth enough with these things. It's giving you little bits to then go off of, but everything that you would want to play with that makes it fun, you're probably going to find on Drive-Thru RPG or DM's Guild.
Okay, I want to give a chance for our later guest, Bronwyn. Can you hear us? You're muted on your end.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great. And once you get your camera up, what are your thoughts on the new edition, kind of the 5.5e, whatever you want to call it, right? Give us an overview of your thoughts. Go ahead.
My thoughts are the same with anything that comes out D&D related. Is I'm just excited for more stuff. I feel like even if there's changes and positive or good, or different rules that people will like or don't like, I'm just excited to try something new. And if we hate it, then we just go back to 5, or all the way back to 3.5, or 2, as some people seem to prefer.
Fair enough. Okay, and once you get your camera on, you'll be good to go. So when it comes to the new mechanics and changes to old mechanics, the Bastion system being updated, etc., to the people who are more skeptical about these changes, why is it a problem that they are making these kinds of upgrades and things? As Bronwyn said, you can always simply go back to the older editions if you don't like the changes that are being made, what what are your concerns or worries regarding the overall hobby itself with regards to the fifth edition update?
That game design tends to proliferate throughout the rest of the industry, whether it's board games, whether it's video games, or whatever have you. People engaging in cash grabs that don't really have any depth, purchased for really any amount of complexity, will just continue proliferating throughout the rest of the games industry. We see this with a lot of in video games. We see this with a lot of live service games. Destiny 2, famously, like very little depth to it whatsoever, just like kind of trash, almost considered like practically an asset flip from Destiny 1. Destiny 1 itself, also mostly trash, no real gameplay depth, trash story, and just kind of like progressed. This spawned a whole bunch of other live service games which were attempting to kill Destiny 2, mostly by being as bad as it, but not having the same audience or having the same weight behind its development team. I don't want to see this repeated with tabletop games a second time, because I think it's already happened in tabletop games. I think tabletop game designers have mostly forgotten what a game is. I think they've forgotten how to like present challenges to the player, which they can then overcome for some kind of benefit, and then repeat this loop over and over again. I think that if you talk to most, even freelance game designers inside the industry, maybe even professional designers, they struggle with this in a way that's just shocking to me. I don't want to see that spread. I don't want to see that proliferate throughout the hobby. I want to see skill checks that you can use to accomplish something in game. I want a reaction from the game, independent of the referee, to then inflict itself on the players and to just have that repeat.
Okay, so is the assumption that doesn't exist right now in D&D?
That 100% doesn't exist in D&D. Barely with combat. Barely with combat.
Okay, so why would we say that Advantage, for instance, is an elegant system? I would describe Advantage as an elegant system because when I communicate this to a player, I'm DMing a player and I go, hey, okay, you're going to help your friend try and climb this cliff by whatever, giving them a leg up. You can get advantage on this check with the help action, whatever. And that player is then going to roll the 2 dice. They're going to take the better result. They're going to feel good about, having this sort of interaction with another. Doesn't that all happen inside of D&D and satisfy the conditions that you just kind of laid out?
No, even though Advantage itself does purchase a lot of depth for minimal complexity, right? There's a lot of ways to get advantage and disadvantage in 5e, and we're allowed to, instead of tracking a ton of individual modifiers, we're able to kind of like stack these up on top of one another. And I do like the advantage disadvantage system, but the example that you just gave me, we're going to climb up a wall, is not an encounter, or is not like a meaningful obstacle to the game. What happens if the players fail that check?
Well, they take some. I mean, what happens if they, get hit by an attack, right? Like they lose some hit points. D&D is a game of it's a game of resources, right? They lose some resources.
Designed for them to continue interacting with these different game elements that are sort of poking and prodding them at all times, and they can respond in several different directions at once. But that comes with opportunity costs. It comes with literal resource costs. If they make the wrong decisions, then they could end up in a state where they're not able to contribute to the combat any longer. You don't see this played out in something like social negotiations. You don't see this played out in exploration, for instance. You just have these, in all other cases besides combat, you just have these pass-fail states that can be thrown in front of the players, but are largely done so to just eat up game time. And if the players fail, either the DM just kind of throws up their hands, not knowing what to do, and they stop using it, or they just decide that they're going to let them progress anyways. I don't think that's good.
Is that not a fault of the tables themselves rather than the system? So yes, I agree with you that a lot of people will simply use skill checks, social challenges, all these things as a simple pass or fail to kind of role play, and that was the goal in and of itself. But again, I'm not an expert at 5th edition by any means, but as I understand it, a good DM can use these systems, the disadvantage, advantage, and things like that, even within combat, and implement skill challenges, social challenges, even within a combat encounter, to provide bonuses or penalties to the players depending on how they interact with them, and also in the game time. In the instance, the hypothetical mentioned of a wall, for example, that players need to climb up. If they fail to climb up that wall, they lose a resource, time, perhaps. They lose the ability to get where they need to go in the time allotted, or they have to pass a perhaps harder challenge later down the road because now they have to do a social engagement with a social challenge with the guards, or a combat encounter with the guards that otherwise they could have bypassed if they were able to be successful. So I guess what I'm trying to figure out here is why D&D currently, as a system, 5.5e specifically, lacks this loop that you're talking about. And after we answer that, I do want to get into the more direction when it comes to like art and the more kind of like wokeification of these things. But go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think that you should have to be a good game designer in order to be a good referee. I don't think that you should have to be a good game designer in order to play a game well. I think that the game should just come with that, right? And there's no reason you can't say, hey, by the way, these obstacles are meaningless unless you have some kind of competing or intersecting challenge coming along. Getting over the wall doesn't really matter. If you're getting chased by something that's chasing you up to that wall, then the wall becomes important because it determines whether the wall changes a state of the party. D&D is like a state machine that the referee can be used with, given that as long as they have procedures for generating content and generating obstacles on the fly, then the referee can be entrusted with just comparing these states against one another and when one state should change to the next. And that produces a lot of tension in the game. I don't think that the referee should have to do both, because I don't think that they can do both. And there's no instruction on doing both because the designers still, according to my opinion of 5.5, still don't understand this to be the case. That's my issue.
James, please.
I see. Yeah. And so a couple things. I don't agree with the idea that Dungeons and Dragons doesn't have any kind of like quality or like benefit to the rule system. I think it's an idea of like where focus is and where people agree to play with what type of system. So to the strength of your point, before I get into the disagreement, I came across this during a free RPG day. Can you guys see this?
Yeah, Unnatural. Is this a Transformers game?
This is Essence 20. It's
Power
products
Rangers?
owned by Renegade Games Studios. If you can make it out, what? Out of curiosity, what products can you see on there? Like what IP?
My Little Pony, Robotech, Power Rangers. I don't know what else.
It's got to be G.I. Joe, right? There's Transformers and G.I. Joe and Power Rangers, right?
Transformers, Power Rangers, G.I. Joe, and My Little Pony. So this is Essence 20. And I actually think that this is a good example for what we're probably going to talk about, even though this is a free RPG on this. The thing is that I found the Essence 20 book. I think it's called Field Manual Guide for Essence 20 or something like that. And the fact is that you say, oh, cool, so it's a system made for all these things. Honestly, no, it's not. It's most likely the fact that Renegade Studios owns Essence 20, and thus now having ownership of these IPs for the time that they have them, they want to then apply a general system to all these things. Now, one, that's not a bad thing inherently of itself. I remember watching a YouTube video about like what they have for it, and it's a kind of interesting progression system. It seemed a little bit similar to Blades in the Dark, if I remember correctly, where you like just have little dots that then increase a degree of something one way or the other. The problem is that it's not specific to the world of all these things. I'm going to get into this. Before My Little Pony was added to this, it kind of made sense thematically to have maybe G.I. Joe have like battles with Transformers or something like that. Kind of sounds cool. Same way that you could then say, okay, Megazord and Transformers. I get that. But here's the general rules for like what comes out of there. If you can see the progression of how someone is supposed to structure an encounter, the third step is after groundbreaking, part 1, part 2, picking up the pieces, part 3, escort innocence, stabilizing structures, stop bad behavior. you know, the bad behavior of the Decepticons or those mean old Cobra terrorists, you know, that was bad of them. Well, why is that language there in the first place? Well, why do you think? My Little Pony is a part of it, and they're trying to include some sense of the wording or the categorization of My Little Pony to it. And it's not out of this love necessarily to then drive home a unique combination of these things. I'm fine with like the system itself. This could be fun as is, but the problem is it's not specific. I'll throw this over in just one more example. To give an example of what this looks like, these are two different versions of Lord of the Rings content. The One Ring and Adventures in Middle Earth. Adventures in Middle Earth, if you can see it, is a 5e adaptation for it. Now, I appreciate that, seeing as how 5e is the system that everybody favors currently, and it's easy to just simply make a character for that and dive into Lord of the Rings. There's a problem. The world of Lord of the Rings does not accommodate to magic the same way that we have it in D&D. How many times has Gandalf ever cast Fireball? How common
Not
are wizards
enough.
in D&D?
Not
And
enough.
not enough. Not enough. Forget the Eagles taking the hobbits all the way to Mordor. We got teleportation. We got, what was
Dimensional
it? Scrying
door,
spells.
right?
In a
Yeah,
plane
yeah.
shift
Christ,
to Mount
Misty
Doom,
Step.
okay?
There's
Exactly.
one in the movies, I think. Yeah, but yeah.
I
There's one,
remember
and
that.
then in Return of the King, there's one fireball-ish thing. Yeah,
Oh,
so-
that's true. That's exploding. Yeah, I think that's right. Or I remember the explosion with like the gates of whatever you call it. But in any case, yeah, the One Ring at least attends to that genre, that idea, the fundamentals. And I think I even tweeted this out one time, where whatever the rule set is that you have, I think it oftentimes goes by people that we say, oh, just have a rule for a game and you know you're set. And that can work, but I think we miss sometimes the fact that rule sets and the fundamentals of those rules, that system, that structure is in there in part to represent the world of whatever it is you're playing. Otherwise, it then goes unrepresented. Sorry, throw it over to
So
whoever
there's
wants.
an interesting question. Am I allowed to can I interact with chat? Wick, do you care?
If it makes me money, go ahead. But after
Yeah, so there's a question in chat that
I want to
is
go
really
with
interesting.
after you're done with that, I want to go to Avalon God, and I want to hear some of his opinions.
Talk
here,
about
and I
Dungeons
wanna-
and Dragons.
Sure. Well, this is a question for Avalon God. Okay, so in chat, there's a question that says, why are you playing a tabletop game if you don't want to use the DM? Isn't that sort of entertainment better served by a video game, right? Where the idea would theoretically be that, okay, if we accept that the DM is sort of a referee and the system should sort of be the engine that drives play, not the DM, right? Aren't we not playing a tabletop RPG at that point? Because in my mind, the sort of the bedrock of the whole medium of a tabletop role-playing game is that I'm not interfacing with a system of game rules. That's the contract by which me and the DM agree that we are going to simulate the world that we're playing in. But at the end of the day, the engine for the game comes from that DM, right? And the DM has the wherewithal to react on the fly to the interesting and out of the box kinds of decisions that I could make that the game itself can't, it would never be able to predict, right? I don't want to play a computer game when I'm playing Dungeons and Dragons. I want to play a role-playing game. I want to play a tabletop role-playing game. And the core interaction of that is me saying, hey, I want to climb that wall in order to get whatever, right? And the DM says, roll an athletics check.
Responses? Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, Chris, you haven't had an opportunity. You go ahead.
I have so much to say. Yeah. No. And for some reason, by the way, the chat isn't working for me. It's saying it won't load. But well, I mean, I think that is like one of the concerns that I've been hearing about, sort of from the community, right? Is this sense of what extent is D&D going to start to feel like a video game, right? And I think that's come up even with some of the personnel changes at Wizards and that kind of stuff. The whole monetization issue, right? Is this going to be transferring for something that we all do around the table and play together in person or even a virtual tabletop, and stuff, to something that's going to be a lot more like Wizards or World of Warcraft, excuse me, something of that sort. So that seems to be like one of the concerns that I'm hearing about the game. I don't know that we know at this point how that's all going to play out, right? That's something that people are wondering about, but and it seems like the signs that Wizards is sending, again, the tea leaves are there to read if you're worried about that, that possible aspect of things. That's not going to prevent people Brian would said, I can go back to second edition if I want to and play with my friends, right? It doesn't really prevent people from playing how they want to necessarily. But there is this concern about sort of the direction of the game and where it's going to be moving. Is it going to be moving to the sort of World of Warcraft high monetization sort of system? And I agree with you, Barry. I mean, as someone who tried and did not like World of Warcraft, I'm sorry if I'm going to suddenly everybody hates me after
I'm a
saying
huge World of Warcraft player. I actually have a
No,
bunch
that's
of
okay.
friends.
You can be a good person still. No, that's okay.
My point is that the thing that I want out of World of Warcraft is different than the thing that I want out of my D&D 5e game.
Absolutely,
Even though,
that's absolutely true. And I play a lot of video games, and I play a lot of RPG video games too. In fact, I'm playing Baldur's Gate 3 right now because I can never seem to complete it. But my experience in Baldur's Gate 3 is very different from my experience playing with a group either online or in person. I play with both types of groups. So I think that's probably, at least in talking to people that I play with and in the community, at large, that seems to be one of the concerns that I'm hearing is that the direction Wizards is taking the game. They're worried, at least. I don't think we know, but they're worried that they're taking it in a game that looks a lot like World of Warcraft rather than quote unquote traditional D&D and such.
Well, it's not just that. So yes, there are a lot of concerns. I think that not the hiring manager, one of the higher ups that they're bringing in was a former World of Warcraft director.
I can explain this really quickly. They just announced the new president for Wizards of the Coast is a guy named Jonathan Haidt. Jonathan Haidt was the executive producer of the Warcraft franchise, the whole franchise at Blizzard for the last 15 years or something. So that is the specific hire that most people are talking about.
Yeah, which again, I think that there are concerns there, but I want to speak largely to kind of the world building concerns that I've been seeing, and I have myself. And a lot of people would point to things like the Mexican orcs and some of the imagery that has come out. One of the responses I get when I bring this up as a concern is, who cares? Let them look how they want. Why does this impact your game? And I think that the answer for me is that how the zeitgeist sees orcs, for example, does impact individual tables. It doesn't have to, right? You can pick people from the more old school, but it does make it so that when someone says the word orc at your table, you have certain things that come to mind. And what I don't want coming to mind, what does not help for my game, and what I want are Mexicans, right? I don't want that to be on people's minds when I say the word orc for a lot of reasons. It just does not fit my world. But when you have all the artwork and imagery for dwarves, orcs, all these things portraying a certain vibe, a certain feel, that will translate to the game and how people interact with it. And yes, in general, obviously every individual table is different, but I'm talking about for the hobby in general. I guess what would to the people who are less concerned about this, like Bronwyn and to Baron and James, you as well. What are some of your responses to those concerns, BM? I'm just very curious.
The easiest way that WOTC could have avoided any kind of controversy, just like they could have avoided it with the Hadozi thing, for as petty and as practical the concerns were, for whatever side you want to do, they could have just made that section of the art people. We got humans in the game. Just make them humans. If you wanted representation and it had any kind of, let's say, either you could say either Latin, Hispanic, or Mexican, or if it was just simply the idea of someone who is a westward traveler, because a lot of that seems like North American westward traveling or pioneering culture. You can have that. That's fine. But at the same time, there's something to be said about where what you've mentioned with it. And it's what is that direction going with? What are people trying to do? I think it's a hodgepodge of a lot of things. I think one, people are, there is, at least you could say, more progressive imagery in there. You could call that woke or not, whatever you want. We can talk about that. On the one hand, I can see it as being a good thing. I can also see it as being a insincere thing that WOTC would do just simply to placate whatever people would want to see of that product. Number two, it's also very different from how they've then presented other products of their own. I think I have. I'll show it when I get a chance of it. Oh, no, it's right here. I put it up here for a reason. Hey, it's 4th edition. Look at that.
My
the
beloved.
imagery that you have in that book itself already, one, is much more, just even this, with the ritual section of it. You can see someone is dead, there's fear going on, and people are panicking in that moment of the art, right? You don't necessarily see that with this from a lot of the art that you have. Now, is that a problem? Is that woke? It could be elements of either of them, to be completely nuanced about it. The reason is that when I think of the other types of games that are out there, this is 7th Sea. When you're portraying any kind of, let's say, this character that you want to then have as an option, whether that's going to be something you're playing or someone else is playing, they have pictures oriented like this. Matter of fact, this is basically what the player's handbook looks like that we've seen images of. You have verticality on either line, you have a picture on either side, and then descriptions of them, right? So stuff like this has existed before. It's just, I think it's a combination of the fact that nobody trusts Wizards of the Coast to be an earnest interlocutor with their own market ever since the OGL situation, and Magic the Gathering as well, with whatever the Pinkertons. That's that stuff going down. So yeah, I think I've said a lot, but there's plenty to like push against and then agree with. I think that there are good things about it, but they just need to be more specific about it. Like the Spelljammer Hadozi thing, you just need a cultural consultant, not because necessarily it was racist. I actually don't even think the Hadozi thing really was definitively racist, but there were a lot of markers there that you could say, I don't know about this messaging, and nobody stopped them. So I'll throw it out.
Nobody stopped them. Should people be stopping them in a fantasy setting? I don't know. Bronwyn, are you going to stop them? Are you going to stand in front of WOTC headquarters?
You're
and
fanning
stop
the
them
fires here.
Go ahead, Bronwyn.
Stop doing racist imagery. That's terrible. I think a lot of the problem, like with art and the imagery and that kind of stuff, like I actually quite enjoy a lot of the art that I've seen from the new player's handbook. There's all these different critiques about it. The lighter, more fairy-like colors, the softer edges, that kind of stuff. And I kind of like that, but I'm also a girl, so who knows? Maybe that's who they're catering to now. I think it's more just, like they said, it's Wizards of the Coast. They are, and well, Hasbro, they are at the core of them just trying to make money. So of course they're going to present new, different ideas, what they think might be more interesting, what they think people might want. I know, and from a lot of games I'm playing, there is a more turn to not less combat, but like to a more in-depth world where you will do other things but then combat. Like even now, like they're starting to work on a crafting system and that kind of stuff. So of course they're going to present imagery that is more than just here's battle. Like here they are traveling, and there could be a bunch of different game mechanics that now go along.
Do you think that's good for the game overall, that they're moving away from the?
I think it is, because that's what I think as far as like an RPG goes. Like we've talked about how we don't want it to be a video game where it's very much like this is like how you play. These are the very set like rules. You need to have the ability to just do something weird and random that, the DM will then have to deal with if you're particularly crazy. But like being able to fully immerse yourself in that world by being able to do anything that you can imagine is part of the love of that game, right? Like if I wanted to start a homestead and like talked about how like where am I getting my building materials and that kind of stuff, like it's nice to know that can be a part of the game.
Do you pull up in front of the Artisans Guild, pick up a bunch of orc workers, right? Drive them to your home, make sure they go to the fantasy equivalent of Lowe's, right? Maybe they can help with your garden?
No, they go to the Gnome Depot. Have you heard about that place?
Gnome Depot.
The Gnome Depot.
Love it.
Depot.
Okay.
That's where you get your home building materials.
They just got in trouble for like firing some lady. It was a couple of weeks ago. I can't remember.
We're not debating politics.
Okay,
this
that's
time,
a
right?
like we get into that, but we didn't come here to that. But finish up,
It had
Bronwyn, then I
nothing
want
to do with politics. It was actually because she didn't know what a Phillips head screwdriver was. But
well, I mean that seems fair if you're working at Home Depot. I don't know, where was I going with my thought? That's the problem, is I get distracted very easily. We were talking about whether or not the different change in artwork is a good thing. Oh, and like the concerns that it's changing how people would view different
Yes,
things
it's
at
changing
table and
the
stuff
how
like
the
that.
game is the zeitgeist of the game, how it's played because of how people will now interact with the new kind of setting material. So for example, will you still be wanting to kill those orcs if they, they got a family, right? And stuff like that. So
Well, and I think that falls again into like the idea of if you don't like how it is, you can always go back to the way it was and like individual tables. Like I said, I think they just wanted to be able to present different variety as far as like they are a corporation. And I mean, sometimes it feels like they're just chucking things at a wall and see what'll stick. There's also the idea of, no publicity is bad publicity. So there's a lot of that. And I mean, at the end of the day, it is a corporation. But then if you're playing at a table where you want to make sure that everybody sees your orcs as what you want them to be, you present them with a handout that's like, this is what my orcs look like.
Okay.
Or this is what the orcs are in this world. You make them not a playable race. You make them like for your table. And I think that's part of like how I feel. It's like, it's everybody's table is, everybody's way they play, right?
I want to toss
yeah.
it to Avalon God real quick. He's had his hands up, and then we'll get some other people in here. Go ahead.
Well, it was just funny. I mean, the thing with the Mexican orcs. So one of the studies I actually published just this year was looking at racial depictions in both D&D editions and the Lord of the Rings movies, going all the way back to the 70s rotoscope movies of orcs specifically. So how much did depictions of orcs depend on sort of racial stereotypes, particularly of black individuals and Asian individuals, because there's been a lot of talk about that in recent years. And essentially the conclusion was really there wasn't that much. That for the most part that depictions of orcs in the various D&D editions and in the movies were largely not dependent upon sort of historical racial stereotypes of either black people or Asian people. Until the Mexican orcs came out, so there was sort of like a bit of a facepalm, a little bit there. That the study came out maybe January, February, and then the Mexican orcs came out. In I think they just did the video in May. I think somewhere May, June, where they highlighted them. But I think also some of the discussion I saw around. A lot of the images, some of those, as I think Bronwyn mentioned, was there's a lot of, or maybe you mentioned, was the sort of a lot of the images are very safe, if you will. That everybody's smiling, everybody's happy, everybody's baking pies in the kitchen, and there's, other than the covers, which tended to have a lot more adventure, there's not a lot of dread or violence or the possibility of death. Now, granted, that was in the preview. Maybe I haven't seen the actual books. Maybe that's somewhat different. But there also was a lot of anachronism. So, like in the Mexican orcs, one of the orcs has like a side shave, right? That is a very common current hairstyle. And I think there were man buns and all kinds of other stuff that you tend to see, that are very modern, very college campusy,
Go ahead,
to a great degree. And so I think a lot of that kind of tone has created, division. And I think I sort of agree with multiculturalist James again that I think they just could have handled this like a little bit with a bit more nuance, a little bit better. I think they were faced with a very difficult issue, in terms of the community's going in multiple different directions, and how do they balance people who are going in different directions. That was always going to be very difficult for them. I think in the end, I don't think they succeeded at that. But again, I'm curious to see where things go. I'm curious to see how the community reacts and how they profit or don't profit from this. So
okay, go ahead.
All right. To kind of bridge a couple things, or at least tack on to some things that have been said. Bronwyn, when you were mentioning the idea of like where it was going, two things came up to my mind that I was just thinking of. One is the idea of themes. Why play D&D instead of another system? And that's actually a legitimate concern to then just have, because if you want this kind of slice of life, like we just heard, baking pies, or then getting very cute arm busts. By the way, I loved the dwarf tattoos. Did you guys see that? It
So
was
they had
with
the matching beard tattoos.
yeah, it was a matching beard. It's like a very dwarf thing, but it's also like a very cute thing, like where you had tattoos of your maybe they're brothers, maybe they're lovers, maybe who knows what they are, right? but they had these tattoos of the other one's beard on their arms, and I thought that was like really cute. But yeah, as far as slice of life goes, there are TTRPGs that are out there that are not involved with any of the fundamentals backing up like a combat system or like a conflict resolution system. So, for example, Tea Time Adventures and what was it? I'm trying Wander Home. These are two systems that seem very, very heavy on kind of a Wind in the Willows vibe, if you would. They're anthropomorphic figures, and they're just simply getting along with their daily life. But there's no spells. There's no like conflict. There's no battling or anything like this. It's just a nice, easy TTRPG. So that's one thing that I think people are concerned about, like you were mentioning. And then also to get to what Ash and Buddy were saying, the wall example, right? Does the example actually build itself from the fundamentals that we have? Well, it's kind of a question of like what kinds of systems we want. So let's say this. If we had like 3 systems, just to put as examples, let's say D&D's in the middle, and then we have Pathfinder, and then we have a rules light OSR game, right? I'm going to use an example of Morkborg here. It's really awesome. It's heavy metal. I highly recommend this game. For this, what we have is like the D20 system where we have the advantage and disadvantage occurring. And then for Pathfinder, we have the idea that like if you fail a skill check, it gets progressively harder, right? Or not only Pathfinder, Call of Cthulhu. Like if you fail a check, there is this mechanic that you can do called a push. So you can roll again your dice. But the problem is that you're then given a GM, the keeper, because it's Call of Cthulhu, gets to decide what plot thematically happens to your character if you fail again. Maybe it'll happen then, maybe it'll happen later. You don't know. The keeper decides. So that's a way to then resolve that. Also, Stormlight Archive, Cosmere has just started on Kickstarter, and that follows with the whole Stormlight series that was made by the same author who then authored Wheel of Time, and they have a similar thing that happens as well. They have a plot die. You can raise the stakes, and then something happens in the plot. All of these different mechanics, I think, attend to that concern. Is it something as bland as, okay, here's a random encounter of 5 wolves. Okay, we fight the wolves. Oh no, another random encounter. Or is there something more to it? And I think that really just simply is left up to what style of gameplay you want in the end.
Okay.
Yep.
Real quick. Let me read the 1,000 bits I got from Laro Talkin. Okay.
Ooh.
Say this. Listen, I'm a black guy. This is him, not me. Okay. Listen, I'm a black guy.
Okay,
I've never felt like orcs are supposed to be us. I could possibly see orcs are actually the monster racists think black people are, but that made the story more interesting. What if the racists are genuinely correct? How do we deal with sentient evil creatures? It only ever started to feel racist when I started hearing a bunch of more progressive people tell me they saw me and my family in those savage monsters. Thank you for the 1,000 bits. Anyway.
That's a cutting attack. Yeah.
Yeah, I have like
Go ahead,
the
Baron.
lowest amount of like regard for this discourse. Honestly, as far as I'm concerned, and I promise not to get political, but as far as I'm concerned, all of the talk about Mexican orcs or whatever is just like kind of an invented controversy because there are YouTube channels out there who depend on like wokeification discourse in order to get angry about anything.
You don't
that's,
think
that's
though
happening.
that there is a kind of a change in how like for example, let's look at the removal of racial bonuses. That is
Sure.
something that was pushed by the woke mob, quote unquote, right? Like because they didn't like how this the kind of like the racial realism that it implied in their games, right? And this is one of the things that kind of sparked this change, this mechanical change that has since been made, where now you don't have racial bonuses, and the criticism would be that it's flattened the world, it's flattened the system, and now there's less delineation between different characters than there was before because we no longer have racial bonuses, things like that.
So I would agree that there is a tension that exists, right? There's obviously a tension that is going to exist between how much, you can have a game where you have multiple different, races and they have different mechanical bonuses, right? There's kind of no version of D&D where playing a Dragonborn and playing an orc are mechanically identical. That would suck. We would all probably agree with that, right? One of the things that makes Dragonborn cool is they have a dragon breath ability that feels part and parcel to that race, to that species, right? One of the things that, you know, gets changed for dwarves in 5.5e is they get tremor sense, right? Which taps into, you know, they are people from the earth who live underground, and so they get the ability to, you know, activate tremor sense, whatever, right? I would agree that's definitely in tension with what we would consider to be in like a real world nature, like race realism or whatever. The point that I'm making is more about the idea of like the Mexican orcs specifically. Frankly, every culture that exists informs is informed by the histories of the people that live in the world. This is not true for just D&D. It's true of Warcraft. It's true of Warhammer, right? It's true of Tolkien, right? I think that this is just a natural, you know, sort of outcropping of the genre itself. And so I just kind of can't get on board with criticisms that are on that basic a level, essentially. Does that make sense?
Sure. I wanna get Rube back into the conversation. Rube, what are some of your thoughts here?
Yeah, I've been thinking. I don't mind the changes to species as such. I think that they mostly don't matter because species primarily haven't mattered for a little while in D&D. It's mostly not impacted the quality of your game or what you're going to be doing in game, with very few exceptions. It would just every once in a while you would have a little reminder that you were playing a wood elf or a little reminder that you were playing a gnome. And by and large didn't impact your gameplay. I think it goes back to my criticism at the beginning of the game, and this is one area in which they might have actually done quite well. I'm not as familiar with all the changes to the individual species. I haven't been paying as much attention to them, but from multiculturalist description, I think that it's probably they're probably paying a little bit more attention to reminding you that you are playing a specific species. Whereas in regular 5th edition, you didn't really have those reminders. You were just receiving a single bonus, or sorry, two bonuses, and maybe a penalty, and some additional like fluff based stuff that you probably weren't going to use that much anyways. So it's primarily a cosmetic change. I think the problem with cosmetic changes is it signals to, rather than fix the issue, rather than double down on the issue, I think it just signals to the people playing your game who are paying attention that you're being kind of lazy, right? Oh, but backgrounds are so much more important now. It's like, they're not really. You just moved around existing mechanics and made other mechanics less important. That's not as interesting to me. So now I feel like you're trying to pull the wool over my eyes. I feel like you're trying to get one over on me rather than express that you've made a fix to the game. As far as the art concerns, I don't know. I tend to agree. I'm getting really tired of the anti-woke griftosphere or the anti-SJW griftosphere. It sucks. I hate seeing their discourse in every new thing that comes out. I just don't want to interact with it at all. I don't know.
That's fair, right? Go ahead, James. You wanted to say something?
Oh yeah, so there's a couple things with that. I kind of I actually I remember when I was thinking about this previously, what version of like clearly visual LGBTQ plus representation in any kind of TTRPG would that kind of genre of, let's say, people who would want to react to that be fine with? I can't really think of it. And when I think of it, so for example, like if it's too woke because you have a clear, let's say, gay couple in something, and that's becoming woke, and thus you don't want to then put your hands on it. Well, how would you then depict any individual from, like, let's say, an IRL demographic in a fantasy genre? How would you do that? It's going to be with something that's very clearly depicting that kind of with depicting how they would be. It's kind of like the Olympic thing when I think about it. I think. And when I say the Olympic thing, everybody here, like, do you guys remember the Olympic quote unquote Last Supper that happened? That thing. Okay, so some people interpreted that as the Last Supper. I look at it and I say, oh yeah, that kind of looks like the Last Supper. I then hear, oh, this is like a feast of Dionysus or something like that because it's about the Greek heritage of the Olympics. I think about that and I feel like, yeah, there was like a blue guy there at one point. I can kind of see that. And I could see either people saying like, hey, this is maybe a jab at like conservative Christianity, or somebody saying like, oh, this is like actually just simply a celebration of one other thing other than Christianity. And I thought, you know what? Why can't it be a combination of these things? Why can't it be like an actual, hey, multicultural thing into which we all live with? After all, we already live with like Christmas and all these other depictions with like
Sure.
Christmas tree and Yule logs, mistletoes. Um, Lots of Santa Claus is somebody who has magical powers giving presents, and I see this like even in depictions of like pictures and like little figures you can put under Christmas trees giving baby Jesus presents. And Santa Claus is literally what a figure who's then depicted from a Saint Nicholas who was who was of darker skin complexion, and then also somebody who was supposed to be like somebody who just was an advocate for Jesus himself. So I can see how there's a pushback to that and during those ages, but we just live with it. And I think sometimes we don't like change a little bit too much. If D&D happens to change so far that like I don't recognize it anymore, then that's what happens. I will find a different how can I say? I guess system to then go with. But you know, change happens, and it's prevalent even through the systems of 1 through 5 and 6.
Avalon God wanted to say something. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think one thing too to keep an eye on is that these debates or controversies within D&D are not isolated from larger debates and controversies that have been going on in American society, right? You know, beginning in the 2010s, and you know, I think there was kind of like this peak, right? You know, around 2020, when in multiple arenas, you know, including in academia, I sort of live in this, you know, this world that, you know, there was a lot of focus, you know, on like race and identity and sexuality and gender and all kinds of other issues. And then it seems to be kind of tapering off, you know, to some extent. And you know, so I think these kind of like dialogues that are happening in D&D are mirroring a lot of things that are happening in politics. They're happening in movies. They're happening in books. They're happening in academia. They're happening in K through 12 education, you know, so on and so forth. And you know, and I think that, you know, probably both sides, whether we're talking about woke or anti-woke, my impression at least is that like the loudest voices on both sides are really approaching this as a moral issue as opposed to a data issue, right? You know, that they're taking stances oftentimes that make themselves feel good morally, you know, and you know they're trying to push that moral agenda onto everyone, which is where I think a lot of the debates about D&D have gone. Is, you know, everybody kind of says, well, you play the game you want at your table, you know, if you don't like it, but nobody wants to be the person who's going to play the game differently at their own table. They want the standard version to be the version that, you know, they like, you know, and both sides are kind of responsible for doing that sort of thing. And what's intriguing to me, so you know, I do research also. You know, I said about like video games and D&D and other things. I also do research on race and policing, actually, which of course was a big part of like the debate going into 2020. And you know, a lot of what interests me is like to the extent that to what extent do like public narratives around these identity issues actually reflect the data. And oftentimes the answer is very poorly. You know, so you know, like on the issue of race and policing. You know, police shootings of unarmed citizens of any race are fairly rare. You know, it doesn't look like race is really the main predictor of these things. It looks like more like it's class issues and so on and so forth. So it's sort of interesting to me that these debates about identity come up at a time when, if you look at kind of like the numbers of these issues in you know, U.S. society, that the evidence suggests that things are as good as they've ever been. You know, in which is not to say perfect, not a racial or identity utopia, but they're as good as they've ever been, probably anywhere on the planet, anywhere in history, you know, in terms of these issues. Which again, it's not to say it's utopia, but it's interesting that the more we become more and more obsessed with these issues, the better things have gotten, in essence, by pretty much any metric you know, you can look at. And so it's interesting. I mean, and this is where I kind of think like, it was going to be always going to be tricky for Wizards to kind of handle an issue like this. Where were they going to go with it? How are they going to balance the woke versus the anti-woke? I don't really like either side. I think they're all very loud and unproductive on both sides of this debate.
So
and I think they missed the boat. Wizards missed the boat
Yeah,
in terms
I-
of figuring a way of balancing that.
like you mentioned something that I want to kind of maybe interrogate just a moment. You mentioned that the more we focus on these issues, it seems to be by every metric, the more things are
Yeah.
getting better. Do you think that's true for the hobby itself of tabletop role playing game? That the more we've focused on all these issues, that it has made the hobby better?
Well, wait.
Um,
Wouldn't
in
it be
terms of,
the
like,
opposite of that? The more we focus on the issues, the more removed we are from. Was that the point that you were making, Avalon God?
yeah, it seems. I mean, it's kind of like this curious sense over the last like 10 to 15 years, right? That as you know, any metric we kind of look at in terms of like racism in the U.S., whether we're talking about explicit racism or implicit racism, they've all gotten better, right? You know, and at the same point, you can look at like people's perception of racism in the
Which
U.S.
has gotten worse. Yes, but my
Which has gotten worse.
my
Yeah.
point is though, and the reason I'm asking this question is because I think that our focus on race, gender, identity, politics, all these things has made the game worse. The hobby, I should say, worse. We have a
Yes.
worse hobby now because we have focused on these things rather than the things we should be focusing on,
I agree.
which are gameplay. Well, I want to talk about the art for a moment because I think a lot of
Okay.
you people, I think a lot of y'all don't
Be
care
careful.
enough about the art stuff, right? Like I grew up on D&D, okay? I remember I've played most of the editions. I've looked at most of the art. While they did have scantily clad women, right? They had scantily clad men too. Sexuality wasn't really ever the focus. And what I mean by that is like someone's sexuality, like their sexual preferences, right? You never had you never had in the artwork in general sex scenes or marriage scenes or none of this straight, gay, whatever. It didn't exist. The art was focused on battles, combat, fighting monsters, fantastical beasts, fantastical cities, all these things. So I do think that it does change how the game is viewed, which I think changes how the game is played when you have focuses on things like this. Look, there's a homosexual couple in our game. There's nothing wrong with that, but it does change the focus from where I think it needs to be. I don't want to see like, look, there's a straight couple in my game either. I don't give a shit about marriage and that kind of thing in my game. It's called Dungeons and Dragons, not like kitchens in wedding halls. Does that make sense?
Cooks, kitchens and cooks. Yeah,
Kitchens and
there
cooks.
you go.
I feel like this is completely like in my mind this matters so like little. When someone is playing D&D, the thing that they're interfacing with is the rules, the dice, right? The game systems, right? All of the stuff about, art
It's not
and
though.
No. But so this is my thing. All the stuff about art, all of that is so much more malleable because, like, so for instance, do you play in bespoke? Like, what game
Sure.
is your
Okay,
D&D game
so-
set in?
Well, I don't play D&D anymore. I play 13th Age, which is a different thing. But like,
Oh my god, I love 13th Age.
13th Age is amazing. But regardless, so let me ask it this way: if you were going to play a Star Wars role-playing game, okay, you would expect that the setting be reflected in how that is played and the imagery that comes along with the game itself. You would want lightsabers to look like fucking lightsabers. You would want the Sith to look like fucking Sith. You would like the Jedi with the monk robes and all that shit. You'd want it to look a certain aesthetic. And if you change that aesthetic, it does change how the game is interacted with and how people interact with the system. Yes, the system itself, the mechanics are the engine, but it does matter. The aerodynamics of your vehicle also matter, right? And so it will change how you play. So my problem with the moving away from combat, as Bronwyn said, to be a more open system, a more like open world type of thing. I don't mind that stuff in my games, but I don't need, right? I don't need that to be given to my game. What I need in my game for Dungeons and Dragons specifically is I want dungeons and I want dragons. I want the adventure part to take the front and center, and I don't feel like it has with the new artwork, which concerns me. But I know a lot of people want to say some stuff. Let's hear from Rube, and then let's hear from Bronwyn, then Baron. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I don't think that this is the case. I do think that there's a relationship between the art and how people play. I think it's an indirect relationship because the rules will remain unchanged. I'm going to still see weapon attacks on my character sheet and spells and hit points. And so I know what the focus of this game is by virtue of looking at the character sheet and the things I can lose by playing it. And the art can be dissonant with that. That's totally fine. All it tells me is that I should have less confidence in the designers in delivering the experience that the character sheet has promised because it's dissonant with the experience that the art indicates. It's not like a direct relationship. It's just the same kind of relationship where I begin panicking because I'm not sure if people really know how to make toasters anymore. And I'm wondering if all of a sudden we lost all ability to make toasters. Would anybody remember how to repeat this process or replicate it? I'm not sure. So I feel the same panic when I'm looking at something like D&D because we've already lost the ability to make half-decent games at least once before. The transition from first edition to second edition, for instance, just completely annihilating massive swaths of the core rule books while making it look like nothing had actually changed. So that's I understand the panic about the art a little bit. It's just tinged too much with like the anti-woke griftosphere.
It's not panic, to be clear. I'm not panicking because again, I've already moved away from Dungeons and Dragons. It's no longer my game of choice, right? Because I feel like it's moved away from me and what I want in a game system, what I want in a game world. Even 5th edition wasn't. I just kind of like shrugged my shoulders. It's moved away from the combat so much. Like, look, I don't need rules so much for social interactions and all these things. I need rules for combat and social challenges and skill challenges and things where things come into conflict, right? I need rules for resolving conflict of some sort. I don't need rules about I don't know. I don't need I can do a better job than the designers at designing a world, just straight up, right? So in all the things that entails. What I want is rules for conflict resolution. But I want to hear from Bronwyn, I want to hear from Baron, and I want to hear from the rest of you as well. Go ahead.
Well, and understand your worry about the art. And yes, the art, very much depicts a lot of what people would be expecting from the game. And I think you hit on the nail on the head a little bit there, where you were like, I've already moved away from D&D. So the thing is, like, you're no longer somebody who's buying D&D anymore. So again, like I said, it's Wizards of the Coast, it's Hasbro. They are trying to
they want to win me back, I'm assuming, because they're losing money.
They don't. No, they don't.
They should. They're losing money. Right? We understand that, right? That they are not doing well.
You weren't going to buy it anyway. It's the same as the people who talk about I still play AD&D or whatever, and I hate all these new rules or all this other stuff. You were already gone.
That's not true. I invested heavily in 4th edition, for example. I loved 4th edition. 4th edition was great. Like, if you had a system that was much more like 4th edition, I would come back.
Go back to 4th edition. Go play 4th edition. My point
that's what 13th age is quite a lot like 4th edition.
I know,
actually.
that's why I moved to.
Yeah.
Right, but I would love to. The problem with 13th age is it's harder to find players because people are less familiar with the system, and that's why I think it's important to have the instead of the homebrew and stuff, to have the basic system to be something I enjoy, because then it widens my chance to find players, different people willing to try the game, and we have a common and shared understanding of what the rules should be, because they are the common, officially understood rules as is. So when people say, oh, just play the way you want at the table, fair enough, but it limits my ability to find players, and it increases the workload I have to onboard players when the official system is so much different than what I want at my table. So I guess this idea that I wouldn't be a customer ever in the future, I just disagree with you, Bronwyn.
Okay, so
let Bronwyn respond.
I'm not saying
I'm sorry.
you wouldn't be a customer in the future. I'm just saying they are now turning their focus to what they have seen the game evolve into, and where all the new players are coming from, and what the new players want. because from like a lot of the games I've played, or if you watch a lot of the real plays these days, it's that like fully immersive, and it's a much like broader kind of idea. And yes, unfortunately, that does water down the system, and like I find that kind of a disappointment there. But like that's kind of where they're going, and why they're now depicting art that shows the different home settings or different backgrounds, different that kind of stuff, because that's something that is new, like that they haven't shown a lot of before. Yes, they've shown lots of combat scenes, they've shown that kind of stuff, but now because people, they are adventuring, they like also go into a feeling of that kind of stuff. And I mean, if you want to go specific, like everybody has been romancing NPCs for all time. Like,
let's be clear, we weren't romancing them. Romance wasn't in what we were doing. Okay, but no, it was.
Boys were trying to romance things. Trust me.
Okay, but okay, you said a couple things, and I want to really kind of stress this, and then I'll let the rest of you, and I promise. You said that they've seen like the actual plays and things like that, and they're moving more in that because that's what they see people gravitating towards. And I think that Critical Role in those things, while bringing in a ton of new players to the hobby, has been the poison pill that has ruined the game in a very real way. Like, I'm not kidding, right? It's become a let me explain. It's become
Matthew
a show.
Mercer!
It's become a show, right? I don't go to the tabletop to play Dungeons and Dragons to put on a fucking show. And that's what I see a lot of people trying to do with their games. New games I join, right? New people I try to interact with, they're all like, hey, let's all stream our game and make some money on the side with it, right? Oh, let's all record this so people can see what we're doing. And this is where the focus is, and it's affected the developers too. The designers of the rules have, consciously or not, decided, as you said, to gravitate towards things like actual plays and how those play out. And I think that is a fundamentally different thing than what I experienced growing up and what I want to experience going forward in my games. When I roll dice on the table, I want to play a game. I don't want to put on a show. But go ahead. I'm going to open it up and let everyone else say that.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm just going to disagree with the characterization of Critical Role here for a moment, because Matt Mercer's game, and I know that I'm like the gamist, like whatever, on the panel right now. Matt Mercer's game specifically rocks. It's awesome.
Yeah.
There are magic items. There are people engaged in faction play. There are domains going to war with one another. They're getting loot like every other fucking week. They're powerful. They're competent in combat. They have NPC allies. They regularly make negotiations with consequences on the other side should they fail or succeed. It's exciting. It's all of the intensity and fun of a good game, just with some extra narration.
It's produced. It's
True.
a product. It's a show. If you think that they aren't scripted at least a little, you're lying to yourself, right?
Yeah, I only watched the first season. I think the idea that they were scripting their die rolls when they kick somebody out for cheating on their die rolls is pretty silly. And specifically, we have videos from their home game. They played the exact same way.
Put it best. It's porn to D&D's sex. You were watching porn and you were assuming that's how sex works, right?
No,
to an extent, yes. But if you're looking at porn and you're assuming that's how sex works,
I have all the stuff for D&D just without a bunch of voice actors at my table. I have all the stuff of Critical Role, and I like it.
So, okay, on my podcast, we have two terms, okay, for types of players that come to tables in D&D. Yeah, I do have a podcast. Okay, Wick. Okay, we have what we call theater kids, and then we have Captain Crunches, okay? Your theater kids are Critical Role enjoyers, right? They show up because they want to embody a character, they want to do an accent, they want to get into hijinks, right? They want to romance NPCs, all of that, right? And then on the other end of that spectrum, you have Captain Crunches, right? Captain Crunches want to stack modifiers, right? They want to hit critical hits that do huge damage. They want to one-shot dragons. They want to fight compelling boss encounters, right? those are two different character profiles. And everybody, we would say this is spectrum. Everybody has a little Captain Crunch in them. Everybody has a little theater kid in them, right? But what it sounds like to me, somebody who's an enjoyer of 13th Age and 4th edition, I'm an enjoyer of 13th Age and 4th edition, right? That person has a lot of Captain Crunch in them. But I do think that
But I'm a
5th
theater
edition,
kid. Hold on. I'm a theater. Like, you think I'm Captain Crunch, and to an extent I am, but I'm the kind of guy. Look, I have a fucking show. I put on a show every week where I go out there, put my face in there. I don't know if you've seen some of the pictures I have online. I dress up. I love to do LARPing and shit. I love that shit, right? But here's the thing. When you start to base your rule system on the aesthetics around how people do the voices and all, there is a fundamentally
prove that.
Say what?
Where have the rule system? Where's the?
I'll
rule
give you
systems
one
built for that?
example. A lot
Sure.
of the race changes and the species changes and things like that. I would contend with you that a large reason that they have flattened out the system is to make it easier to play out on the screen, if you will, to play out on the webcams and things, if you will, because they can dress up how they want and do their little cosplays and not worry about taking penalties or bonuses at the actual table. I think that is a major reason that they've made some of their
It's
changes.
good that so for instance, in fourth edition, right? Dwarves had a benefit to wisdom and con, right? They were minus dex, they were plus con plus wisdom, right?
They had
So
speed penalties too. There's quite a bit,
exactly.
right?
So as a cleric, it was a good idea to play a dwarf, but as a as a ranger, it was probably a bad idea to play a dwarf, right? Rangers need dex, dwarves get a penalty to dex, right? Like this kind of thing, right? Removing ability scores, I think, has way more to do with opening up the possibility of allowing different race class combinations.
Those were always, hold on. No, I reject that notion because, again, I played. One of the things that I liked about the racial bonuses and penalties, it allowed me to play a character that did have a penalty. And when we talk about role playing and when we talk about going in and not having everything min-max, but potentially, purposely, I should say, handicapping your character in order to have a different experience of the game, I can no longer do that.
No, you still can. You do a point buy, you start with an 8. I'm playing a 5th edition rogue right now, Mateo Vasquez. He's very charismatic. He's very dexterous. He has an 8 in intelligence, and he's fucking stupid, okay? Like, that's very much a part of 5th edition.
Sorry, that's not quite the same experience. Like, if I'm playing a video game and I have a penalty with my starting class or starting loadout, whatever have you, and I'm trying to excel at some portion of the game that leverages this combination of unintuitive benefits that I've collected at character creation or fleet selection, loadout selection, whatever have you. That is a competence fantasy that I'm leveraging through my good gameplay. That is not the same as removing the penalty to begin with and then stacking on benefits I would like to acquire later in play. That's a different.
Do you disagree that an 8 gives you a -1 as that's an ability score penalty? Mateo Vasquez has a -1 on his intelligence.
No, I'm not disagreeing at all. I'm saying that if you play a character in 5th edition that does not have a we're gonna do the ranger example. You play a dwarf, you don't get your bonus to dexterity. You are playing a ranger who has less dexterity than you would if you were playing a wood elf or something like that, right? So the reason somebody wants to do that is either they really want to immerse themselves in the fantasy of a dwarf ranger, or, and you could do both of these, or they're trying to leverage some quality of the dwarf into an additional reward later on. I want to mix this thing I get from the dwarf and leverage the benefits of the ranger while knowing that I'm not
and to piggyback
as
off
good
of
as
that,
I could be going with the standard.
And to piggyback off that and to kind of flesh out the point we were making here is the fact that they have removed a lot of the the racial bonuses, penalties, and identities makes it harder for me as someone who wants to design a character or who wants to play a character that grows in certain ways or is stunted in others. I lose out on options now, right?
Okay,
I lose out on options.
To be clear,
that's not good.
those bonuses and penalties still exist, but they exist as
Okay,
part of backgrounds.
But there's also, for example, in 4th edition, there were feats that you could choose only if you took certain racial, if you were a certain race.
That's true. That's
Right?
also true in 5th edition.
Is that true in 5.5e?
Yeah.
Okay.
In fact, it's actually more powerful in 5.5e. One of the things that gets changed in 5.5 is races level up with you to a certain extent. So in 3.5, for instance, you get all of your sort of racial features at level 1, but they had this thing called racial levels. You could take a level in Centaur, for instance, in order to get some whatever racial bonuses to Centaur, right? It's a very weird side rule in 3.5. That rule has kind of been brought back and been kind of mainstreamed by 5.5 edition because as a Dragonborn, I'm now getting bonuses at level 3 and level 5 that are keyed into my Dragonborn heritage rather than just everything being keyed into my class. This is also something that they pulled from Pathfinder 2nd edition. Pathfinder also does
that's
this.
That's a good change. If that's, I'd have to look into the specifics of that, but I like that change, and I hope that they lean into that change. But
there's a little bit of that in regular 5th edition. Like with Drow would get different spells as they leveled up. I think it's 3rd level you get Dancing Lights, 5th level you get 3rd level you get Fairy Fire, 5th level you get Darkness. You can cast these once per long rest. And it's a fun, interesting experience. Sure, I think that the issue that we're describing, and again, I don't think it's a big issue when it comes to species, because it just didn't make that much of a difference when you were building these characters. But the aesthetics of the game did make it feel like a difference. Did make it feel like you were going to change your character the more that you invested in character creation. Even though that was a 100% a lie, you were still going to have a shitty experience past level 7, no matter what character you were playing, almost always. But there was I brought this up at the very beginning of the show, by removing the fantasy or removing the implication that they were going to deliver on this fantasy, rather than actually delivering on it, feels like a blow. Even if I don't agree with all of which language or reasoning for why this feels like a blow to him, it still does feel like a blow to me for other reasons. And it presents an air of uncaringness to existing players of the game that they're going to react to with apathy or disdain. That's perfectly reasonable. Whereas if I go off to Pathfinder 2nd edition, that did away with the racial ability scores as well. But they're based on class, and I can play those classes and I can build them in interesting ways that leverage interesting features of my chosen race in other ways. If I want to play a Leshy Druid, it's going to be different from a Wood Elf Druid, and so on and so forth. That's not the experience that's being sold to us in 5.5.
So
and that's a perfectly valid concern.
It sounds like that argument relies on psychoanalyzing the people who work at Wizards. Do you think that the people who work at Wizards don't care about D&D and the people who work at Paizo care about Pathfinder?
At all. I think they've presented themselves in a way that signals that they're not caring. That's a very different thing from whether or not they're actually not caring.
Right. But how are you deriving that information, right? Is this because they didn't make changes to the Ranger that you wanted them to make? That is the thing that is signaling to you that they don't care, overlap. Right?
I think the signal there is that we've found an issue. Everybody has reported this to be an issue. We have, in some places, removed the thing that people read as being an issue and just didn't deal with it at all. And in other places, we doubled down on the issue. That's different from just like things I like or don't like. That's a matter of presentation. Presentation is part of design.
I also miss that restrictions on classes from races. Okay, I know this wasn't a 4th edition thing, but this is other editions.
So BX and 0 edition.
Yeah, I missed that.
Yeah, I know.
Interesting.
I missed that.
Okay.
I missed that. And the reason I do is from a design perspective as well as a roleplay perspective. But restrictions on how I build and play in the game are interesting or can be interesting. And I think that removing limitations actually makes it less interesting to me. I want to have a set of limitations and be able to choose the set of limitations based on my choices of character, class, feat, race, etc., right? In such a way that I have interesting limitations that during the gameplay, I have to play around these limitations. I have to find interesting ways and novel ways to get over or around these limitations that I otherwise would not. If any race and any class can do anything, it becomes less mechanically interesting, less role-playingly interesting. Just I
don't.
cease to care. Does that make sense?
I feel like there's a difference between the expression, right, of a player versus the. I guess I would call it like the minute-to-minute gameplay. So, for instance, when I'm playing say I'm playing a Dragonborn Paladin, right, and I have access to Dragon's Breath versus playing a human rogue who does not. That does feel meaningfully different because having access to Dragon's Breath is a pretty core, aspect of those two different characters, right? Would that not qualify for what you're describing?
Repeat that. I got distracted. I'm sorry. Something.
Oh, it's okay. So essentially, what I'm laying out is, to me, the expression of any race can be any class is a little bit different than there are sort of like no limitations on my character. There are fundamental limitations on my character because I'm only choosing one class and I'm only choosing one race, right? But like I said, my Dragonborn Paladin has access to Dragon's Breath, which is something my human rogue will never have access to, right? But my human rogue has access to, expertise with thieves' tools and can lockpick stuff, which my Dragonborn Paladin will never have access to, right? Does that not satisfy the conditions that you're laying out?
It does. It does. But it doesn't feel like it does. This is the problem.
Why not?
Presentation is part of design, because previously it was a penalty that I had to work around, and now it is something that I either have that is 100% opt into.
Yeah, opt-in versus opt-out. I
Yeah.
think that's a good descriptor. It's opt-in versus opt-out, and I think that does change how people interact with the game, right? You mentioned psychoanalyzing. Like, I think that because we are humans, all of us in real life, well, most of us, and we all play this game, like, we all act like humans, and we all, the designers should recognize that humans make certain decisions and like and dislike certain things, and different humans can have different likes and dislikes. But what I'm trying to convey here, and maybe I'm failing at this, right? Is that I want to feel as if, my choices matter. And one of the ways that helps me feel that my choices matter is when they have significant limitations that are placed upon it. Not that I can't buy into this, but that because I have bought into this, I now lack X, Y, and Z. Does that make sense?
Do you know the story of rested experience with World of Warcraft? Have you ever heard this? This is like a common game design thing. Okay, so
tell me your
in
story.
MMORPGs, really quick, super quick history lesson. In MMORPGs, there used to be this thing called experience debt. The idea was, if you played for a really long time, this is in early versions of World of Warcraft, if you played for a really long time, you started to accrue a penalty. And this is because, the designers didn't want people to essentially sort of like no-life the game, right? But what they found is, though, people really hated that. That sounds like an awful system. So what they did was, they flipped it. They flipped it around. And they said, well, when you're logged off, when you're not logged onto the game, you start accruing a benefit. You accrue what's called rested experience, which is twice as much experience for a certain amount of time, right? Players loved rested experience. And the idea is that a positive reinforcement is something that players enjoy. A negative reinforcement is something that players balk against, right? Players want a bonus. They want to avoid a penalty, essentially, right?
Okay, I know a lot of video game players want this, and I understand a lot of TTRPG players may want this, but I don't want this. I like penalties. I don't know.
Well,
Maybe I'm different. Maybe I'm built different.
Whatever. I built Mateo with a penalty. I just played a session with Mateo where I was able to lockpick through a window, lockpick through a door, sneak through the harbor master's office, and then I couldn't pass the investigation checks in order to steal the records that I needed to. And that was because of the penalty that I had assigned to my character in intelligence, because I built the character that way, right?
And that was already a feature of 5th edition. But what
exactly
now is not a feature is the opportunity. We have lost the opportunity opportunity cost of picking one species over another when it comes to, again, just the bonuses.
Well, so to be clear, if I were to build Mateo in 5.5 edition, he would be the exact same, right? I
Right.
could still build a character with an 8 intelligence who would be failing those investigations.
Yeah, that's what I just said. But
Okay.
the difference now is that if you had an 18 index, that would be a product of your choices in 5th edition, whereas in 5.5, or sorry, that would be a product of choosing certain options in 5th edition, whereas now it's a product of just you choosing at a baseline.
Stat
You're not like
placement.
No.
competing with
You
any
still
other
choose.
choices.
You still choose ability score modifiers. You just choose them as part of your background instead of as your background as a thief is the thing that gives you dex instead of being an elf
Yeah.
gives you dex.
No, I know. Yeah, but no, thank you, and thank you for
But isn't
clarifying.
that also a choice?
Not in the same way,
Why
because
not?
the other one was bundled with other choices, such as with my species and the benefits and features I would get from
Exactly.
my species. That
Well,
might
so you're
not be
saying-
Hold on.
intuitively
This is important.
That might not be intuitively combined with my choice of being a dwarf rogue or a dwarf ranger, but which I, as a player, could later down the line try to leverage into a superior benefit that made it worth giving up that potential +2 to dexterity that I would have gotten from being a wood elf or choosing something else that was standard.
Last thing
a
I'll
puzzle
say on this.
that I'm working on.
Last thing I'll say on this, and we gotta move on, right? The package deal, right? Because in your example where you chose your stat line, right? You took that 8 by choice. You placed your stat there by choice, but it came with no other strings attached. You had no other choices that you had to or could not now make based on that 8, right? Except for maybe feat options that required a 13 intelligence. I don't know if they still do that, right? But with something like a -2 penalty to dexterity for a dwarf, when I choose that, I now have a whole host of other benefits and penalties that come along with that package deal, the boons and banes, if you will, that are part of a package deal that make the choice more interesting. And do you understand how that works?
I just want to clarify that package deal still exists. It just exists as part of the background is not just ability scores, right? It also has other mechanics, and those mechanics are part of that package deal of me, choosing whatever for my background, right?
Okay.
And at the same time, by the way, races also are a package deal because when you're playing a dwarf, you're getting tremor sense and you're getting this, but you're also moving at 20 feet per second or round or whatever else, right? Like both of those are package deals, but all they did is really took the ability scores off of races and put them onto backgrounds. They basically said your life as a thief is what made you dexterous, not your heritage, right? Which I think that's a pretty reasonable.
It depends on how they did it. It depends on how they did it, honestly,
Okay.
because if they did it in a way that I am only able to choose the thief background, having played a thief, then that is not going to satisfy the conditions.
To be clear, I'm not even really going to bat for
Yeah.
the background changes. Frankly, I actually kind of dislike the background changes because I like the 5.0 version of backgrounds better. But I just want to be clear about the way that the system is built to work in 5.5 edition.
Okay.
Yeah, again, it's presentation. I still don't think that the species still matters all that much. I'm more just concerned about the other parts of the game that have been left to rot. With the exception of Bastions, I thought that was a cool change.
To pull this out a little bit, to expand the conversation, I guess, and we are kind of running near the end, right? We're not there yet, but we're getting close. I'll just go around the room and ask, what is the thing you hope the most with this coming edition? What is the thing you fear the most with this coming edition? One of each. And we'll start with James, multiculturalist James, to be clear. Then we'll go to Bronwyn, and then we'll just go around. Go ahead.
What I hope with this edition?
Yeah, hope, your biggest hope, your biggest fear.
Man, well, I'll say this. With the hope of the edition, I guess it's seeing as how it's already come out with the player's handbook already. I don't have a huge amount of hope. Honestly, I guess I'll put this out there. Seeing as how I have critiques of any one side on like the culture war issue for a lot of things. I have a lot of things to say against things that might be too quote unquote SJWE or woke or whatever you want to say. But I will say this just to push back on like the anti-woke side or whatever it is. Representation I think does matter. I think whenever you see like yourself in either characters or then any other gameplay or whatever that happens to be, that signals at least to you, hey, we're thinking about you. Whether it's done properly or improperly is another conversation. I don't mind talking about that. I think in terms of hoping for it, on the practical side of like when playing it, I hope that the digital side of it, to be completely honest, is much more well integrated, and that we see something a bit more with maps, MAPS, just so that we can get better customization for it. But my fears with it, here's what I fear with it, and we didn't really talk about this too much. I fear that maybe there'll be another corporate push for like an OGL-esque situation that happens in the future, and I mean, it's always in the background of people's minds now. I mean, there's the whole push was that, or the pushback was the orc license, right? That Paizo spearheaded, and we'll see what the community does from there. But in any case, there's cringe stuff that I can see easily with the new edition, but I am happy with seeing that there is representation in their thoughts and some version of their products.
I don't know if I want them thinking about me. I'm gonna be real with you, but no, thank you for the thank you for that. Bronwyn, what are your hope and what is your biggest fear?
I guess by hopes, I think the thing I'm most excited for is actually backgrounds, as we were talking about, because I'd heard that they did a revamp on that, and I'm really excited about that because I like backstories and that kind of stuff. And I know there's a lot of people that push back on the backstories. I'm not talking like your big epic, like 20-page long, like I did all these adventures. No, just like the thing that made you an adventurer, like, and what made your skills, right? So this is what I did before. This is why I have a +2 in Dex, or whatever it is that they're now adding, so that it actually feels like the backgrounds matter more. It falls into that, like, you're worried that the species feels like it matters less, but the backgrounds matter more. I always felt like the backgrounds like didn't matter at all. Like I would just arbitrarily pick something that whatever matched up with whatever class I was playing. So if I'm playing a bard, I took the entertainer background. If I'm, playing a ranger, I took the hermit background. It didn't really matter too much, but now I feel like it will have much more of an impact. So I'm really excited about that. It's funny because I was also trying to work with a game that I still haven't got off the ground, where instead of choosing a background, I was going to have characters tell me what it is that they did in the village, whether they were the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, whatever. And then I would assign certain abilities based on what they would have learned while doing that job. So I think that's really helpful with
like
the background.
13th age skill system, actually. That sounds almost exactly like that, but no, that's a good idea. Thank you for that.
And I guess what I'm afraid of, or my fears for it, is that I've seen a lot of stuff talking about like we've seen that the hire for an AI or the monetization, this idea of the pay per subscription service or that kind of stuff. Like, I really don't want it to go that way. I mean, that's part of why I love D&D. You own the books, whether you want to play 2, 3, 4, whatever, you own the books or the PDF, or you've pirated the PDF. Not that I would ever do something like that. So you can just play it whenever you want, as opposed to like where they already kind of go with D&D Beyond. Whereas if you don't own the books on the D&D Beyond, you can't make your character as you would if you were just writing it down on paper with all the like books that you have in your library or what you can find on Unearthed Arcana, that kind of stuff. So I don't want them going that way.
Well, thank you for that. Rube, what do you got?
Yeah, so things that I'm afraid of, I think I've already explained earlier in the show. I'm afraid that they're going to continue their trend, or I know that they're going to continue their trend of flattening the overall gameplay experience, encouraging people to just kind of throw in these cosmetic obstacles that do nothing but take away game time from something more meaningful, and produce failure in people's campaigns for reasons that they don't understand or even really know how to approach or begin to fix, because they have no guidance on doing it, because the designers themselves don't understand why these are fail states for the campaign or fail states for the parties overall, or why it's bad gaming or fake gaming to begin with. I am excited, just to cap that thought off, I'm afraid that they will continue this trend, and it will continue to infect the rest of the hobby by pulling in new people who don't understand how games work, but they think that the fact that the DM's guide sucks somehow means that 5th edition is easier to modify or easier to homebrew for, easier to adjust yourself than other games. Having designed for it for 8 years, I can tell you that's not the case. God, I never want to make another product for 5th edition again. It's a fucking nightmare, because for reasons I won't get into right now. Things that I'm hopeful for, the fact that they included bastions, which I initially thought were not going to make it into the game. I was convinced that they weren't going to make it into the game because they had no reference. There's no reference to bastions inside of most of the Unearthed Arcana character classes, which is usually the defining feature, whether or not an optional rule is actually going to be part of the game or just kind of going to be left out. I'm really inspired by the fact that they actually put bastions in. And while their expression of bastions and stronghold rules will suck and will be inferior to, at the very least, like products that have already come out from MCDM, Kingdoms and Warfare, even Strongholds and Followers did a better job of it, I think it will help inspire people to pay attention to other modes of play besides just combat and wonder why they don't have the same rules structure, the same rules infrastructure to build their games on for other modes of play that they would like to engage in, like exploration and whatever. So that's what I'm excited for.
What about you, Avalon God?
All right, yeah. So for Hope, I mean, I like games that have a lot of options for player creation and development. And I think like one of the things I've always struggled with new editions is oftentimes those options feel pretty limited at the front. And I think one of the things it feels like Wizards have done very well is sort of really front load a lot of this stuff. So there's lots of different classes and subclasses. There's like, I don't know, it was like 1,001 different spells or something like that. Lots of different feats. So it seems like they're really front loading this edition with a lot of those choices that give you a lot of options in character development. I know not everybody loves that. I've seen some criticism of that, but that is something that I really, really like.
Just real quick, Stardust, thank you for the raid on YouTube. Really appreciate you guys. Welcome, Dusters. Okay, we're talking Dungeons and Dragons, so take a seat. Anyway, sorry, Avalon God, please continue.
Oh, you're good. You're good. I mean, in terms of fears, I mean, I'm not like staying up nights worrying about anything, but so it's not really a fear. It's more of a hypothesis, and I think it's kind of some of the stuff I've been talking about today. Is that like a lot of different other parts of society, I think people in 2020 kind of responded to a very online movement that they interpreted as representing a societal consensus when it really didn't. And so my theory, my hypothesis, if you will, is that Wizards kind of did the same thing, and that the tone of this edition, that they might have misjudged the audience to some extent, or they might have misjudged the extent to which the consensus in the gaming community wanted some of the particular tone that they're now representing. And so it's a hypothesis. I could be wrong. I'd be very curious to see, like, financially how 5.5 does compare to previous editions. So it'll sort of be interesting and exciting for me either way. That's why I say it's not really a fear. I don't have any stock in Wizards of the Coast or anything. But I will be kind of curious to see how this edition does compared to 5e, 3e, 2e, 1e. Left 4e out a little bit because 4e also I think ended up with a little bit of chaos with Essentials. But but I'll just be kind of curious to see, does the community respond the way that Wizards hope? I'm hearing a lot of criticism and ambivalence about this version that I really didn't hear about even 4th edition or 3rd edition. So, but that could just be who I'm hanging out with. I don't have hard numbers on that. So we'll see. I'll be curious.
We will see indeed. Bairn, biggest hope and biggest fear. Man, my hope is that your mic starts
My
to
hope
work.
is that I would use my push to talk. Okay, you guys. My biggest hope can be explained. I guess we would call it with like a vignette or something, right? One of the new systems that they're introducing is called Weapon Mastery. This is a new system for martial players that says that every weapon in the game has some mastery component, something that you can do with this weapon because it is this weapon that only martial players can unlock. So rangers, rogues, barbarians, etc. Weapon Mastery is exactly the kind, and by the way, weapon masteries look like the cleave feat from 3.5. That is a weapon mastery on the great axe, right? There's a weapon mastery that says that you can make your offhand attacks with like with a dagger much easier, right? Like that's the weapon mastery of a dagger, this kind of stuff, right? It helps differentiate different weapons from each other, right? Now the difference between a greatsword and a maul is not the one does slashing damage, the other does bludgeoning damage. It's that a greatsword has the Gray's weapon mastery and a maul has the has the topple weapon mastery, right? And using a maul fundamentally alters, your second to second gameplay, the choices that you're making with the attacks that you're making. And that is the basis of a system gives me so much hope, right? I can foresee the version of weapon mastery that permeates the rest of the source books, right? Whatever the 2025 version of Tasha's looks like, right? Introducing new weapons with new weapon masteries, right? That I can use to express myself through my character, that I can use to build unique and interesting characters. That's something that I think is really neat and really, I have a lot of hope for that. The thing that I am most fearful of is the nature of the virtual tabletop. To me, D&D is about the interaction between a player and a dungeon master, right? There is a storyteller who is orchestrating this narrative that I am playing through, and they have ultimate control and mastery over the world in which my character, exists, essentially. Virtual tabletops, while, incredibly useful, I play Roll20 games. I obviously have a lot of love for Roll20, but at the end of the day, they do take something away from sort of the magic of that one-to-one connection that I can make with another person who is running a game for me, who is writing a story with me, right? And the more that they lean into that virtual tabletop, the more I'm afraid they will end up sort of degrading and eroding that experience.
Okay, gang, we have had a great discussion today on all these topics. I think that overall, I haven't seen anything with 5.5 that's going to bring me back. I could be wrong. Again, I've perused it. I have not done a deep dive. At the end of the day, I do have concerns with the art direction. I do have concerns with the mechanical changes. And I do have concerns with just the overall feel of the Dungeons and Dragons. As many of you echoed, moving more towards the virtual tabletop does have some benefits, but I think it does take away from the core of what it means to play a role-playing game. That's being able to smell your players when you roll those dice, the feel of the dice in your hands as you roll them, okay? These things are core to me, to the experience of Dungeons and Dragons. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for being here. Tomorrow at 6 p.m. Eastern, we're going to have Lonerbox, we're going to have Paula Wright, and we're going to have Veteran Gamer UK. We'll be talking about the British riots that are going on right now. That was, can I just say real quick before I let you guys do your outros, that was the hardest show to book I've ever had to book because too many people, British people, were afraid that if they got on and they expressed their opinions, they would get arrested or fined. Like, no doubt. I'm not like pulling the wool over your eyes here. These are the major concern I've heard, and that's why it was so hard to book for it. But we've got some brave souls tomorrow. It should be fun. Tell people where they can find you and any closing thoughts. We'll start with Bronwyn. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm Bronwyn. I can be found on Twitter as Softcore Game Girl, where I post mostly about tabletop role-playing games, video games I'm doing, like some life stuff, and bikini pics. You can also find me on Twitter, where I am currently running through Baldur's Gate 1, and planning to hopefully go through the whole cycle of them. It's kind of fun. I also sometimes play Fortnite and Stardew Valley just to get my viewership up a little bit. So that's where I'll be. And now I'll be playing my next episode of Baldur's Gate on Wednesday.
Check her out, gang. The links to all these individuals are in my description on my YouTube, so check them out. Give them a follow, give them a subscribe. All these things really helps. Go ahead, multiculturalist James.
Thank you so much for having me, Wick. Love just talking about all this geeky shit online, and it's always a good fun time, especially when diving into any of the specifics. So the MC James, so you can find me on Start Playing Games. Didn't put that in the link, that's my bad, but in any case, that's there. And also the Multiculturalist James, you can find that on Twitch. I almost never do Twitch, but I primarily try to do YouTube for the most part. Any closing thoughts on everything? I think, it's a combination of many things. I think ultimately there are it's the problem of representation being over concerned about, and then the idea of no representation being present at all, which is the result that I think some people then have as like a cultural issue in some cases. And I think there's perfectly fine ideas to be talked about on either of those ends. So one of the ideas that you mentioned, you had said the idea of like a show versus a game. And also to the other idea that I heard from Buddy is the idea of in-person versus online, right? I think all these things have their places, and what we sometimes marry together as being a continuum of a quality of something sometimes aren't seen as their own individual categories for where they may fit for different demographics of different people. But then again, that's why we have panels and shows like this. So thank you very much.
Check him out, gang. I don't know if he does bikini pics, but he has some great takes on gaming. It's really fun. You should check him out. Give him a follow. Next up, we have Baron, please.
Listen, I on Mondays at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific, I do the Some Derps Talk About Games podcast. And listen, if any of you guys want to come and hang out and talk about more D&D, okay, we can argue about whether 5e is dog shit or not, right? Feel free to send me a message. Just on closing thoughts, listen, Wick, give it a chance, buddy. I think you would like it. Okay. Read some of the rule book. I bet you'd have a good time. No, I'm just kidding. Thank you so much for coming out, and you can follow me on Twitter at @BuddySola.
Check him out, gang. Thank you for reaching out. Really appreciate you. Give him a follow and stuff. Next up, Avalon God, please.
All right, yeah. Well, thanks for having me on today. This has been a lot of fun. I've enjoyed talking to everybody here. People can find me. God, where can they find me? I have a Substack. If people want to check that out, it's Grimoire Manor, one word, .substack.com. I also have a website that is unimaginably named just my name. It's ChristopherJFerguson.com. And you can also follow me on Twitter, which is kind of a hellscape, but if you want to join me there, it's CJ Ferguson 1111. And last thoughts. I think the good news for all of us is basically just that whether we love 1D&D or not, there's lots of options out there. So we all have the opportunity to game however we want to game, and we're just going to keep going. So cool.
Well, thanks for being here. Really appreciate you reaching out, and check him out, gang. Check out his Substack and all that. It's really good stuff. Last but certainly not least, Gelatinous Rube.
Yeah, it was a fun discussion. Thank you all for joining. I think that we got to a bunch of the issues that I wanted to get to, so I was pretty satisfied. There were a few about monetization and the focus on the digital, or maybe the relationship between the DM and the players I always enjoy discussing, that we didn't get to this time. I'm sure it'll come up later, but it was overall fairly high quality, and I enjoy it. I don't think that this is going to be a good addition because the previous one was also terrible. I think that the only thing 5.5e had running for it was the fact that a bunch of professional real game designers took it off the tabletop and ported it to a video game, and by porting it to a video game had to actually make sure that it was functional in some capacity, and so actually quite made a pretty decent game. Maybe that will inspire future designers that tabletop RPGs don't have to suck. They can be good. Just look at what video games occasionally do. I will be, as I was in the past, I've seen a lot of people talking shit in the chat who I'm sure have terrible opinions and can't defend them, but I invite you to try anyways. In Wick's Discord here, I'm going to be in the debate channel. You are welcome to pose your thoughts that you had earlier, which were terrible, indefensible shit. I look forward to speaking with you, and thank you always for watching. You can find me at Gelatinous Rube on YouTube. I have a Substack post coming later tonight or early tomorrow morning about the relationship between mechanics and storytelling and the narrative context of D&D. And I think it's pretty germane to our discussions. I think you'll enjoy it.
Check him out, gang. Thank you for being here. Gang, I love you all, chatters and participants alike. Tomorrow, 6 p.m. Eastern, Mr. Bill, I found some British people. Don't worry, I don't need the Americans for this one. We can do the British people tomorrow. Yeah, we'll raid out in Aurora. Wait, bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye. Wave.
Bye-bye.